And welcome back to Stormworks Basics tutorial. So this one's going to be a long one. I've been wanting to do this one for a while. A lot of people seem to be very mystified by gearing and gear ratios and how all of it works. So I've been thinking about how to do this video, and it's going to be long and in depth. And I think that's the best way to do it to get people to understand the gearing. So I will put in bookmarks in there so you can go to certain sections if you don't want to listen to everything, or go to a certain spot. And I think that'll make it a lot easier. It can be a very dense topic, and so I want to kind of get into it, and but I want to be thorough. The better you understand the mechanics of things in real life, the easier things are going to be in game. And a lot of people criticize the game for not being very quote unquote realistic. But a lot of the things in game, while not perfectly realistic, are quite often, they follow a lot of real physics, and you can utilize a lot of real-world information to improve your builds and to work through it. So let's go through gearing. And so they're essentially, let's first just grab, we'll look up gear here. So there are 3 gearboxes, and this is a question that comes up quite often. I still see it, especially from new players. They'll ask, is there any difference between the 3 gearboxes? And the answer is no. There used to be. There used to be differences with these 3 gearboxes. And so, for example, right now I could take a one-to-one gearbox, and I could put it on an enormous, massive engine that produces an insane amount of torque, and it would work perfectly fine. And before, when they first released these, if you each one of these had a torque limit. So for example, if you put this 1x1 on a massive 5x5 engine, it would break, and then you'd have to repair it. And so that became problematic. It also became quite annoying that, for example, for me to make a turboshaft helicopter, I would need to use a 3x3 gearbox to not break it. Well, now that's 3 times as big. Actually, I think it's more than 3 times as big. But, so that makes it much bigger. So these 3 gearboxes, you can use any of them that you want. And so that's great because, it allows you to put to anything in game that they can make smaller. I always find nice because you can hide things, and you can, it helps you with space, and you can make things look realistic. All right, so that's the first thing, is the gearboxes. You can use any of the 3. For example, I like to use 5x5s when I'm doing a big, huge motor because it looks right. It looks kind of funky having a tiny little motor. All right, so the next thing we need to know about gearboxes is the arrow. So one of these arrows I'm going to face towards the engine, and one of these arrows I'm going to face away from the engine. All right, so if we click on the gearbox, we have 2 ratios. We have ratio off, and we have ratio on. And we have some numbers. If we click left, we have 1, -1. So that's our reverse gear. That means for 1 rotation of the engine, this one will do 1 rotation in reverse. All right? So a 1-to-1 gear ratio is 1 rotation of the engine, 1 rotation of whatever we're turning, a propeller, a wheel, whatever we want to turn. I won't get too far in depth of input shaft and output shaft. You essentially have your input shaft coming from your engine into a real gearbox, and then it connects to your output shaft, which goes out. That's what this is essentially showing, is that. So if the arrow is pointing towards the engine, let's look at the arrow. If the arrow points towards the engine, what that is doing is that is multiplying the number of rotations of the engine by the fraction and to whatever you're spinning. So for example, when do you want to multiply and increase the RPM? Well, you want to do that with a propeller. All right. So if you're going to do a propeller, you want to do it this way. And so what this does is this allows you to turn your motor slower, and it allows you to turn your propeller faster. And so let's talk about the fundamentals of a propeller really quick. So if you want to think, so often propellers are referred to as screws. And the reason they're referred to as screws is because they work like a screw. And so let me just grab a quick picture of a screw. And so kind of like on a propeller, a screw has threads. And let me see if I can find it. Okay, so you see the threads of the screw. So this is known as thread pitch. So the different thread pitch of a screw, like you can see this one has a reasonably flat thread pitch. If we look at this one, this is steeper. That is a steeper pitch. All right, now we can also do pitch with airplane propellers. We can't do pitch with boat propellers. I wish we could. But so the whole theory of a screw and how it works is for every one rotation of the screw, it goes a certain distance into whatever the surface is. So let's say this is a wood screw, and we're going to put it into wood. And so we do one rotation. So for every one rotation of the screw, we go 1 centimeter into the wood or 1 millimeter into the wood, whatever it might be. I forget what it's actually set up to be. But that is thread pitch, okay? And so we actually have something very similar with propellers. Let it be airplane or let it be a boat propeller. So for every one rotation of the propeller of the boat, we go a certain distance forward, all right? And you can actually tell what that is by, if you set this engine to go at 1 RPS, you could then tell, what, how far you're going forward in the water. Right, so if you do 1 RPS and it moves you 1 meter per second, you know that for every one turn, you move 1 meter. So for every one rotation of the screw, you're moving in to the water or across the water 1 meter. And so you know that if you're going 19 rotations per second, you're going to go 19 meters per second. All right, and so you can easily figure that out. Doing some testing. We're not going to get into that, but that's how a propeller works. So if you move this engine at, say, 20 RPS, and it's a 1-to-1 gear ratio, you're going to move this at 20 RPS. And again, let's just go with the number of 1 rotation per second. You're going to be moving at 20 meters per second. Now, if we go in here, and let's just do some simple math, we'll do a 2-to-1, okay? So for every 1 rotation of the engine, we're going to be rotating the propeller twice. So if we go 20 RPS on the engine now, we're going to be going 40 meters per second through the water. Now, there are some other things you need to worry about, and that is going to be resistance and load. And so you have to worry about, as you add more load and resistance, it's going to be putting strain on your engine. You don't get this for free. As you increase the gearing, it's decreasing the torque. So what you're doing when the arrow is facing the engine is you are trading torque for RPS. So the torque will go down and the RPS will go up. Now if we look at the other side here, the arrow's facing away. If we did the same 2-to-1 on this side, this is different. This is for every 2, because the arrow's facing away, for every 2 rotations of the engine, we get 1 rotation of whatever we put on there. What is this good for? Well, this is good for wheels. And the reason this is good for wheels is a wheel touches the ground. All right, so this has resistance. Because it's touching the ground, it's right, the ground is much less likely to move than the water is. Right, as the propeller moves, you get, in real life, you get cavitation, and it will essentially slip through the water, right? And a wheel, you can eventually spin up a wheel, but it's going to add a lot of resistance. So what you need to do is you need to down gear. You need to actually reduce the gearing so that you can, you can get moving. And the bigger and the heavier your vehicle is, say you have a big truck, you need to down gear even more. All right, so let's quickly do some tests on this. So I'm not going to do cooling. Actually, I don't want to do any of this. Let's do this. Let's do a push button. We're going to make this really simple. So I'm going to do a push button here. I want a constant number. And I'm going to go to the throttle. And I'm going to go a constant number of 1. That's going to give us maximum throttle. And then with these old-timey engines, I'm just doing this for simplicity's sake. I have an RPS limiter at 20. All right. And actually, let me do less because I don't want to hear it. Let's do 3. 5. We can go down to 5. I haven't used these in forever. All right, let's check the logic here. This is going to go to the starters. All right. And you'll also notice we have some on-off nodes here at the gearboxes. So what I'm going to do is I'm put a couple toggles. Put a couple toggles right here. And these are going to go to the gearboxes. Now you only need these. Symmetry not on? Symmetry is of course not on, because why would I turn symmetry on? So you only need these if you want to shift gears. And so this allows you to have multiple gears for your gearboxes, 2 gears. All right, so we can select 2 gears. So right here we have 2, 1, and let's do 1, 1. So over here we have 2, 1, and we have 1, 1. Actually, I'll do it the other way. All right, 1, 1, 1, 1, and let's make this the bottom one's 2, 1. So when we turn it on, ratio on, that's going to go to the on here. All right, so those are connected. All right, we should be able to read off of what they're doing. All right, temperature. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's spawn this. I'm going to turn on infinite electricity, infinite fuel. I'm going to disable engine overheating. That's just going to allow me to run this without putting stuff on it. All right, so the 2 engines are started. They're running around 5 RPS. All right. Currently, the gearbox is set to 1 to 1. So if you notice, RPS A is 5, RPS B is 5. Right? That's a 1 to 1 gear ratio. So when you do gearing, it's multiplying fractions. All right. So we'll get into that when we start stacking gearboxes. All right. But what you're doing is you're multiplying 1 by 1. Yes, 1 over 1 by 1 over 1. 1 times 1 is 1. Okay. And so we have the wheel over here. Now, this one should be the same, right? They're both 1 to 1, 5, 5. Okay, now let's swap gearboxes. So see how the propeller is going faster now. Engine's still going 5. Now look. The engine is the bottom number, the B. That's going 5. Because there's a 2 to 1, that's going 10. So you have 1 times 2 is 2 over 1 is 2. All right, so that's going 2 RPS, or I'm sorry, 10 RPS. It's going twice as fast as the engine. This one should be going half as fast as the engine when I switch it. So this should actually slow down. So if we look at this, that's going 5. Let's press this. And you notice it's going 2.5. So now the wheel is moving half as much, okay? So let's get into some more stuff with this. So the next thing we'll do here is we will select these 2, and we'll just move them out 1. And let's put in a T-piece. The cat is in the background stealing zip ties. And we'll put a torque gauge on here, torque meter. All right, and let's merge this back together. All right, and let's go ahead and let's start these up now. All right, and so the torque doesn't work like it in game, like it does in real life, but we can still use it. So let's look at a torque meter. So we're producing 50 torque. All right, so at 5 RPS, the engine is producing 50 torque. Look over here, it should be the same. It's actually producing less now. That's probably because the wheel is heavier, I would say. I bet it's because the wheel is causing more resistance. All right, now let's switch to turn that on. Now, look, the torque went up. The torque went from 40 to 69. So like I was saying, if you point the arrow towards the engine, you are trading torque, the torque made by the engine, for RPM. You don't get anything for free. You can't get both. You have to trade. So you're taking torque from this far engine with the propeller. All right, this one here. You're trading the torque of the engine for rotation. All right, so we're still at 1 to 1. Let's go. Okay, let's look at our torque. That's 50. This should go down. All right, look, so we went from 50 to 35, but we sped up. Now, as your torque goes down, you're going to be able to do less work. All right, now, the faster you spin this propeller, again, remember, the faster you spin the propeller, right, for every 1 rotation, you go, these are made-up numbers, 1 meter per second, 1 meter forward. For every 1 rotation, you go forward 1 meter, right? So the more rotations, the faster you're going to go, but your torque keeps going down. So eventually, you're going to get to the point where the torque, the resistance of the propeller, the engine can't overcome it and the engine stalls and dies. Well, that means when you get to that point, you need a bigger engine. All right, so that's when you know if you need a bigger engine. All right, so this one here is trading RPS, right? We're reducing RPS. We're going from 5 to 2.5, but we're increasing our torque. And so what this is doing is this is allowing us to move a larger truck, a heavier load. And so to put this in perspective, my Mac Pinnacle that I made that's on the workshop, that has the gear ratios are realistic within 0.02 of the real truck. And so let me bring up my gear spreadsheet. I'm trying to find where it is. All right, and so you want to reduce the gear ratios in order to get higher torque. So as you reduce RPS, you're increasing torque. As you reduce torque, you're increasing the RPS essentially with these gearboxes. So let's go ahead and let's look at my spreadsheet. So this is a very complex spreadsheet about my gear ratios for my Mac Pinnacle. So let's go ahead and let's kind of look. I'm going to try to find where it is here. All right. All right, so right here is the latest Mac Pinnacles, Eaton Fuller 10. That's the mining truck. Let's find the Mac Pinnacle here. I actually did label it. I believe I did. Eaton Fuller 10 speed. So right here, this is it right here. All right, and so so this is the Eaton 10 speed here. And so what I did was I went online and I looked up the gear ratios of the real truck. So it's starts at a 15 to 1, then it goes to a 10 to 1, a 7.5 to 1, a 6 to 1, a 5 to 1, a 3.2 to 1, a 2.45 to 1, a 181 to 1, a 135 to 1, and then the final gear, 10th gear, is a 1 to 1. All right. Now, in a truck, you need to start off in a low gear because you're moving a very heavy amount of weight, and so the engine never gains more power, right? You know, the engine's making the same amount of power, so you need to trade your RPM, your RPS in this case, for more torque. The torque allows you to do more work. So you have to go slower, but you're able to do more work. And so what you're doing is you're trading the RPS from the engine for torque. All right, and so if we go back to the game and we look, that's what the that's what this gearbox on this side is doing. It's trading that RPS. We're reducing the RPS to get more torque. This is doing the opposite. We are increasing the RPS, but we're losing torque. All right, so that's a very basic kind of concept that you need to understand how this works. All right, so next thing, let's go into gearbox stacking. All right, so you're going to want to stack your gearboxes. Not always. Let's make that declarative statement. For example, most small boats, one gearbox is going to be fine. You know, but you know, just for the sake of argument, we'll do this. I don't want symmetry on. All right, so we're going to point all the arrows the same way. All right. All right, and let's merge these back together. All right, now I hear this mistake constantly from people. All right, the way you do gear ratios is you're multiplying fractions. You are not adding fractions. Again, think of them as fractions, right? A 3-to-1 gear ratio is either 3/1, 3 rotations of the engine, 1 rotation of the output shaft, in this case the wheel, right? So if the arrow is pointing away, you have a 3-to-1 gear ratio. 3 on the engine, 1 on the wheel, all right? If you have it set up with this way, where the arrow is pointing towards the engine, it's a 1/3 gear ratio. 1 rotation of the engine for 3 rotations of the propeller. So let's start stacking these, okay? And we'll make them really simple, okay? We'll do a, I'm not going to switch them. We'll do a 2-to-1, a 2-to-1. We'll just make them all 2-to-1, make the math really simple. All right, and what I'm actually going to do is, since these are all set up, I'm just going to copy these, because this way I don't have to change the gear ratios again, and I'm going to put them here. All right, and so those are all set up as well. So these are all 2-to-1s. Okay, so remember, we multiply our fractions. All right, so this is 1/2. Okay, so is it? Yes, 1 over 2. So 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 times 1, that's 1, right? 2 times 2 is 4, right? Times 2 is 8, right? Times 2 is 16. So this is a 1 to 16 gear ratio. So for every 1 rotation of the engine, the propeller is going to turn 16 times. All right, we have the opposite over here. This is a 16 to 1 gear ratio. For every 16 revolutions of the engine, we turn the wheel once. Okay, that's going to give us more torque. So if we remember our numbers, we started here at 50. When at 1 to 1, it was 50. When I reduced, it went down, I think, 39. This one went from 40 up to 30, up to 69. This should go really high in torque. This should go much lower in torque, but higher RPM. So this will go very slow, but have a lot of power. This will go very fast, but not have a lot of power. All right, so let's get these started up again. All right, I might actually stall the engine here. Yep, I stalled the engine. So this, remember I said, when you get to this situation, you need more engine, right? If the propeller is going slower, the more gears you have, just this propeller, the actual mass of this propeller probably, because it's not interacting with the air, but just the mass of this propeller, this engine, because I've upgeared it so much, it does not have the power in this engine to be able to turn this little propeller just in the air, let alone the water. But let's go over and look over at this wheel. This is having no problems, right? This is at 5 RPS, right? And the reason is pretty simple. This is down gearing, all right? So let's look at our torque meter, right? When we have one gearbox, right, at a 2 to 1, we had a 69 units of torque. Right now we have 427. The higher the torque, the more work we can do, the bigger the vehicle we can operate. All right, so remember, this is so weak because we're trading our torque. We're getting rid of torque. If we look at our torque, we get a static torque number. We only have 23 torque. We don't even have enough torque to turn this propeller in the air, let alone in the water. So how do we do that? Well, remember what I said. If you get in a situation where adding more gearing is actually making you go slower, that means you need to add more engines. All right, and so in this case, what I'm just going to do is I'm going to tack a couple more of these medium engines on here, and we'll just tie them up here. All right, so when you get to this point, you need to just add more power because you essentially have traded away. You need more power in order to get that extra torque, right? We can't make more torque with this engine, right? That engine at 5 RPS is going to make the same torque all day. We can rev up, but we're going to keep it static at 5 RPS. So if you get in this situation, what you need to do is add more engines. And so you'll hear people all the time say add more engines. And sometimes that's what you need to do. You need to add more engines. Because essentially, we're tripling the torque now. All right, so pretty simple. So now let's merge that back. All right, and let's spawn it. All right, so we have 3 engines, right? They're actually working. See, they're below 5. The reason they're below 5 is this little propeller that's now going 61 RPS. That's why it's jittery, because it's actually going super duper fast. This little propeller is causing enough resistance that these engines can't stay at 5. That's too much. That's too much work to be done. And let's look at the torque. It's because we're down at 26 units of torque. Right? We've reduced our torque. We've traded torque for RPM. The opposite of what we've done for this wheel. So you see how the more gearboxes we add, the smaller or the more motors we need on this side. It's actually the opposite on this. We could have a very tiny little motor move a huge truck. It's just not going to move it very fast if we add more and more gears. All right, so that's how you get more power. So again, you'll see these questions. So let's put in some real applications. So you see these questions all the time on Reddit or in the forums, and people are asking, how do I make my boat go faster? Well, the simple answer is the faster you turn your propeller or your screw, the faster you're going to go. And again, remember why. For every 1 rotation of the propeller, because it is a fixed pitch, For every 1 rotation of the propeller, it wants to go a set distance forward, let's say 1 meter. For every 1 rotation, it wants to go 1 meter forward. So if you can make it go 61 RPS, that's 61 meters per second. That's over 120 miles an hour. Theoretically, you could get. But the problem is, once we put this in the water, right, these engines can barely run with this in the air. There's no way this is going to run in the water. All right, so you might need these 3 motors and to run, a 4-to-1 gear ratio in the water. All right. So let's go over my spreadsheet again. The spreadsheet is a little bit confusing, but I think it's a good way to kind of learn it. So let's go back to the Eaton Fuller 10-speed, and now let's talk about how do we combine gears. And you'll see people do this all the time in boats. In real life, boats don't shift gears. There might be some boats that shift gears, but the vast majority of boats don't shift gears. And the reason they don't shift gears is they have most boats, again, a lot of this is going to be most, or many. There are boats that have variable pitch propellers that can change the pitch of their propellers. We don't have that in game, unfortunately, but generally in a boat, you want to have 1 gear ratio, and you change your RPS to modulate the speed. So again, if we're at 5 RPS, and we let me just kill some of this noise. If we're at 5 RPS, and we do a 2-to-1 gear ratio, right? We're going 2 RPS now. Well, if we go to 10 RPS in the engine, we are now going 20 RPS, right? And so let's go through. So on a boat, you really don't want to change gears. You want to find the gear that you want to be in. Now, some people love to change gears in game. That's fine. It's a game. Do whatever you want. But it's not very realistic. Boats generally have 1 gear ratio that they're running, and you change your throttle to do that. Now, a land vehicle, a truck, again, because the wheel is touching the ground. Now, you can, in cars, like somebody asked me, why do you don't need a 10-speed transmission in game? Well, I do. I built a truck, and I drive trucks for a living, and I need 10 gears in real life to run. And so, if we look at the gear ratios for the Eaton Fuller 10-speed, which I operate in real life, so how do I get these gear ratios? So what did I do? I started out with the gears that the website actually told me were right. And so if you notice, first gears are 15-to-1, second's a 10-to-1, 7.5-to-1, 6.5-to-1, 3.32-to-1, 2.45-to-1, 1.81, and 1.35. So my goal was to get close to these. These are the gear ratios that the website for the Eaton Fuller 10-speed transmission published. All right, and so these are first gear, second gear, third, fourth, fifth, all the way up to 10th gear because it's a 10-speed. All right, so then what do? Well, I came out here and I actually only need I need 5 gears on this one. So I have 5 gears, all right? So I can do all of this with 5 gears, all right? I might actually, in this one I have a high and a low box, so I actually need more than that. But so let's look at the chart. So really quickly, I have my numerator and my denominator, all right, my top and the bottom. I have gear 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, my total gear ratio, and then I reduce it. So 30 divided by 2 is a 15-to-1. So that's how I get to a 15-to-1 gear ratio. So I started with 3-to-1. So remember, I can use 2 numbers on one gearbox. So I think I do a 3-to-1, 1-to-1 on this one. And so I take a 3-to-1. I multiply it by a 5-to-2. So that's 3 times 5 is 15 divided by 2 is going to give me 7.5, right? And then I need to double that, right? So 7.5 times 2 is 15 over 1 is 1 times 1 is 15 over 1, 15 over 1, and then we get 15 over 1. So that's my first gear ratio. So on my second gear ratio, I need to go down, right? So I want it a 10-to-1. So what did I do? 3-to-1 times 5-to-2 times 2-to-1, and then I start putting them backwards. All right. So you'll see people sometimes say, "Oh, well, you should put a gearbox backwards." Often, that absolutely is correct, but often they don't do the math, and then they wonder why they're just guessing. I'm not guessing, all right? I'm doing the math. So if you look, so I know that gear 1, gear 2, gear 3, and gear 3. So 1, 2, and 3, they're all facing the motor, all right? Gear 4 is facing away from the motor, and this is my reduction gear. All right. This is actually my increasing gear. So let's look at this one. I want a 10 to 1, so I do 3 to 1 times 5 to 2. That's a 7.5 over 1 times 2 to 1. That's a 15 over 1. And then I do 15 times 2 is 30. All right. No, what did I do? I did the math wrong. 15 times 2, 30. 30 times 2 is 60. Okay, 30 times 2 is 60. And then 1 times 2 is 2, times 1 is 2, times 3 is 6, so a 60 over 6. All right, and then I reduce it, so I do 60 divided by 6. That's a 10 to 1 gear ratio. That's how I got my 10 to 1. Next gear ratios. All right, I need a 7.5 over 1. Well, we already figured that out, right? That's a 7.5 over 1 right there. All right, so all we have to do is 3 to 1 times 5 to 2, 1 to 1, 1 to 1, 1 to 1, gives me a 15 over 2, or a 7.5 to 1. All right, next one, I need a 6 to 1. So again, I need to reduce it. So I do 3 to 1 times 2 to 1. That's a 6 over 1. Done. All right, next one's a 5 to 1. So I do a 1 to 1 times a 5 to 2 times a 2 to 1 is a 10 over 2. That's a 5 to 1. Now, this is where I can't get as accurate as the real thing, but if you notice, I get within 0.02 of the real truck. So I do a 6.5, and so let me talk about the Eaton Fuller 10-speed. So in trucks, you actually have two gearboxes. They're kind of sitting next to each other. And so you have your low-range gearbox and you have your high-range gearbox. And what happens is the engine has it has a shaft coming out of it that's turning at a certain RPS, okay? And then you have another gear set. And what you're doing is you're moving the gears from that shaft to mesh with the gears on another shaft. That's called your output shaft. That output shaft then turns the shaft that turns the wheels, essentially. And so what happens in these big rig engines, in these tractor gearboxes, is you actually flip your gear set over to the other side. And so now you have a different set of gears. So it's like having two gearboxes smashed up against each other. So 1 through 5 is the low-range gearbox, and then we go into 6 through 10, which is the higher-range gearbox. That's why you'll see these numbers change. It's like having two gearboxes, essentially. So you could make your truck run like this with just these 5 gears if you wanted, but this is a second gearbox. So here, as you can see, I wanted to get a 3.2 to 1. So I do a 6.5, 3.2, 9.5. That's 162 over 50, or a 3.24 to 1. So that's very close to where it should be. This one's a 2.7, 2.45 is the real one. This is a 1.8. That's a 1.81's a real one. 1.25, 1.35, and then 1 to 1's just, you run straight ones all the way through. And that way you get a 1 to 1. All right, and so this is very complicated, it seems, but I recommend making your own formulas like this, making your own table if you're going to do complex gearboxes in game. This is very helpful because I'll show you my Mac Pinnacle and why you'd want to do that. So let's go ahead and recall this. So the Mac Pinnacle has the Eaton Fuller 10-speed. I think I actually pulled that. I have not released it yet. So here's the Eaton Fuller 10-speed that I built. Okay, so this is the shifter. This is the transmission. This is all you really have to worry about here, and this is the controller for it. We'll go into the controller. So this is the Eaton Fuller 10-speed. So let's look at it. So remember I said that tractor engine, it's essentially two transmissions bolted together. So this is your low box, and this is your high range box. And then I have an overdrive here, and that allows me to reduce it. If you remember, I have one of my 3.2 gearboxes was facing the opposite direction. All right, so this is my engine here, right? The engine comes down here. It goes through this gearbox, which is facing away from the engine. And then it comes back, and they all face towards the engine. And then all I do is I have a couple clutches here that actually, 3 clutches. So if I wanted to use my low box, this clutch is engaged, this one's disengaged. And then this is your actual drive clutch. And then if I'm in my high range box, this clutch is engaged, this one is disengaged, and this one is actually what's passing through. So it's complicated, I know. But what it allows you to do is it allows you to make trucks that operate properly. And so let's try to do some, I don't want to get too far in the weeds with this here. All right, so let's do a little overview here. I know this is dense. This is one of the reasons I've kind of, I've tried doing this a couple times and put this off. So some more things you need to know about gearing in game. The only time you need power is when you're going to switch the gearbox. So you'll often see some of my builds, I don't have any of these connected to power. That's probably because I'm not swapping them. So in a boat, I don't do that. So let me save this really quick. Gearing example. All right, let's open up a boat. So let's do the latest boat I was working on. So if we look at this, I have one gearbox per engine. And these are powered. The reason they're powered is I put a reverse gear in there. So I have my 3-to-1 gear ratio is the gear ratio I've decided on. And I have a reverse gear. All right. So that's all I have in the boat. Now if we look at that, right, and so you see how with this boat can go 70 miles an hour. It has one gearbox. All right. The Eaton Fuller 10-speed for, let's do the Pinnacle. So this is the Mac Pinnacle. This has an Eaton Fuller 10-speed in it. This has, let's count the gearboxes here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 6, 7 gearboxes in this one to make this one run. And this goes 70 miles an hour as well on the road. All right, and let's actually take this out. So this is what I drive in real life. And so I actually, at work, I remember most of them, but at work, I actually wrote down all of the, speeds, so I know what speeds I should be going at. Now remember, let's talk about, we talked about the theory of a propeller. Let's talk about the theory of a wheel, okay? So a wheel kind of operates like a propeller. So now imagine you have this wheel here, okay? Now imagine you cut the tire, right? You cut the tire all the way through here and you laid it out flat, right? So let's say you cut this tire, you laid it out flat, and it's 1 meter long, right? So for every 1 rotation of your tire, you're going to go 1 meter forward, right? So if our engine or our final drive, if our wheel moves at 1 meter per second, that's how fast we're going to go if our tire is 1 meter in diameter. Let's say we have a 2 meter diameter. So for every 1 rotation, we're going to go 2 meters per second. So that's how you can figure out your speed via your tire diameter. I could actually figure out my tire diameter, by doing some math. All right, so let's start this up. And I shut off the game noises, so let me turn those back on. Okay, so now this truck can haul pretty much anything. And the reason I can do that is, again, it's set up like a proper truck. It has, its first gear is 15-to-1. All right. I faked the RPM, which is not helpful in this case, but because I had to make it look right. I'm not in gear. Am I in gear? Tractor brakes released. Okay. All right, so I'm going full throttle now. And this is as fast as I'll ever go. The only time I could go faster is if I was rolling down a hill. All right, so this is basic gearing. And if you know the fundamentals of gearing, you can easily do this. So my engine's doing a certain RPM, and I wish I could figure it out. Let me do this really quick. I had to fake the actual RPS of the engine because of reasons. Because I don't, the engines in game, they're not set right, and so they end up screaming. And so they're very loud, overly loud, and we don't need that. And so let me just do this really quick. I'm going to hook this up, and I'll kind of show you what I mean here. So let's go ahead and let's just take the RPS off of this engine, and we'll stick it in this dial so I can read it. All right, and then we'll get going here. And so I can probably tell you the tire diameter too if I know this. All right, so we're in first gear. If we were to look back at the spreadsheet, which everybody probably hates the spreadsheet at this point, first gear is a 15-to-1 gear ratio. So for every 15 rotations of the engine, we only get 1 rotation of the wheels, okay? So let's get rolling on this one. All right, so I should be able to figure out our speed by doing some simple calculations here. So we're going, our RPS of the engine is 9.5. Okay, so our engine is turning at 9.5 RPS. Okay, and so I know just off how I set the engine up what speed we're going, but let's look at the speed. We're going 5 miles per hour. Okay, so let me convert that to meters per second. mph to meters per second. All right, so that is 0.44. Sorry, that is 2.2 meters per second. All right, so at 9.5 meters per second on the engine, we're going 2.2 meters per second. So let's see, 9.5 divided by 2.2. All right, so that right there is showing you the gearing, right? So 9.5 will allow us to go 2.2 meters per second. Let's upshift. So I'm going to shift up to my next gear. You'll see my gear shifter move here. All right, so now we're in second gear. Let me see if I can find, I probably can't read the dial. Okay, so now we're still at 9.5, right? We have not changed the RPM, right? I'm pegged. I've got the pedal all the way to the metal. Now let's look at our speed, 7. This is actually how my truck at work really operates. First gear is good for 5 miles an hour. That's as fast as you go. And it's actually good in a truck because you have to haul a lot of weight, and you want to be able, you always want to be in the right gear for the right speed. So we only gained 2 miles an hour by changing gears, but we're doing so. Our gearing is allowing us to keep the same RPS in the engine, but change how fast we're going. Let's go to third gear. So every time that I upshift, I'm losing torque. I'm losing the ability to do work, but remember momentum. Force equals mass times acceleration. So if we have momentum, right, I'm trying to think of a better way to explain it. So let's explain it this way. An object in motion tends to stay in motion. An object at rest tends to stay at rest. The truck, when it has a big heavy trailer, it wants to stay at rest. And so it requires a lot of work to get that truck moving. All right. Once the truck is moving, right, you could take your finger and push on and keep it at speed because it wants to stay in motion. An object in motion tends to stay in motion. All right. So you need to have a lot of torque to get it moving. But once it's moving, you can see now we're in fourth gear. Fourth gear is 12. Fifth gear is 15. Sixth gear is 23 miles an hour. Seventh is 28. Now we start getting into some really high gears. That's eighth is 42 miles an hour. I'm going to turn around before I get going too fast. I'll squeal a little bit here. I have to slow down just a little bit so I don't fall off. But I can't go any faster than that unless I'm rolling down a hill, right? The engine is capped at 9.5, right? The gear ratio is telling me that's as fast I'm going to go is 42. I just can't, right? It's math. It's simple math. Let's go up a gear. 9. We're going 60. And I'm just eating up terrain really quick, so I have to turn around, slow down, and turn around again. We'll keep it in 9th. So remember, an object in motion tends to stay in motion, right? So let's go to 10th. And 10th is my final gear, as you can see. So for every 1 rotation of the engine, we get 1 rotation of the wheels. And so I could actually figure out 10th is 1 to 1. Let me see if I can't figure out my speed here, my tire diameter. I'm going to just try to do it off the top of my head. I might get it wrong. So let's go up to our max speed here. I need to figure it out before we go. All right, 70, let's say. I'm not going to be able to get there. All right, I'm not going to be able to get there. So let's show you another thing. So remember, we trade RPS for torque, right? So when we're in a higher gear ratio, I'm losing torque every gear I go up. So let's do this as a little test. So I'm going to start in 10th gear, right? 10th gear is 1 to 1. So remember, I have very little torque at this point, right? 15 to 1, I'm trading my my RPS for torque. Right here, I'm going to have very low torque. So listen to the engine when I try to take off in 10th gear. See how the truck was like stalling? That's because it didn't even have enough torque to move the weight of the truck itself. All right, now if I put a trailer on this, it would be very hard for this to move in 10th gear. I'd probably stall. So I know this is probably a little bit complex. I would love to hear what you guys think about it. I'd love to hear about what you want to know about gearing. You know, I'm certainly no expert. Let me go over a little bit more kind of theory of gears. So I'm trying to think of the best way to do it. Let's bring up paint. All right, let's bring up paint here. I'm going to do a new paint. Paint. All right, so let me kind of show you the theory of gearing here. So so really simply, let me draw a line. It's not need a dark color. Okay, so there's a line. Okay, so this is a lever, right? So the longer so if I have a short little lever, right? Think about it like you have a tiny little wrench, right? If you have a tiny little wrench, right, you can push on that wrench really hard and you might not turn the screw you're trying to turn. If you have a really long lever, right, the longer your lever, the more torque you're able to exert, right? So we have a nice long lever. We're able to exert more torque. So now let's think about that in gears. I don't want square. I want rectangle. What do I want? I don't want a rectangle. I want a circle. All right, so here we have a circle. Now think of this as our gear, right? So this is our gear. So if we have a tiny little gear, right? Right, a tiny little gear, right? That's a lever, right? It's teeth, right? So in order to figure out our lever, right, we draw a line from the center to the outside. That's the radius, right? That's how long our lever is, right? So let me do a bigger circle. So there's a bigger circle. Let's switch over to a line. And right there, that's the radius of our circle. That's how long our lever is. So if we measured from here to there, the radius of our circle, that's how much leverage we can get, right? And all a gear does is it puts teeth on the end of the of it there, right? And so that's our lever. The bigger the gears I have, the more leverage I get. So when you're in a low-range transmission, you're using bigger gears. When you go up in gearing, you're actually using smaller and smaller gears, and this makes sense, right? So let's say you're using a big gear, right? So for every one rotation of the engine, right? So this is how it would look in the transmission. I know this is kind of a mess at the moment, but so in a transmission, right, you have two gears touching each other, right? Now imagine they have teeth. I'm not drawing teeth. So this is the engine. So as the engine turns, right? So let's say the engine's turning at 10 RPS. This is a big gear, right? So it's going to take a long time. If this is turning at 10, let's say this is 10 times, right? That's a 10-to-1 gear ratio. Let's say this one's 10 times the size of this one. For every 10 rotations of this one, it's going to rotate this one once. All right, now let's look at the other way, right? So let's say this is the one from the engine. And let's say this is, remember, I just did the Mac Pinnacle, and it had its final gear is a 1-to-1 gear ratio, right? So 1-to-1 gear ratio, I wish that was transparent. A 1-to-1 gear ratio looks like that, essentially. It's two of the same gears touching each other, right? So for every one rotation of this gear, let me see if I can paste one here. So for every one rotation of this gear, we essentially get one rotation of this gear, right? And so you think about all our gear ratios, right? So, you know, if this is the engine gear, we have one that's twice as big, right? That's a 2-to-1 gear ratio. If we have the engine gear and this one here is 3 times as big, that's a 3-to-1 gear ratio. If the engine gear is, you know, 5 times, it's a 5-to-1 gear ratio. And so that's how you are doing your gear ratios, essentially. I know this is probably complicated. I really love to hear what you guys have to think. I've tried to do this episode a couple times, and it's pretty complex, and I'm trying to keep it basic. So, you know, the main overview, let's do a quick overview of the video and what's most important for the game. And again, I would love to hear your questions. You can go into my Discord. I'll make sure the link's in there. And you can post any questions you have, and I can add to the video with that. But the main things, if you have the arrow pointing towards the engine, all right, that is trading the torque of the engine for RPS, and that is good for a propeller. If you have the arrow pointing away from the engine, that is trading the RPS of the engine for torque. You don't get anything for free. You don't get to keep your torque and add RPS. You don't get to do that. All right. If you want to have more torque and get more RPS, you need more engines. All right. We could actually trade this engine out for a small engine, and it would probably not stall. Right. So I could take a small motor like this, and I could hook this up to that wheel, and it would run just fine, because This is down gearing it. All right. You know, this one I need 3 to turn a little incy-bincy propeller. This one I can turn a little wheel, and I need 1 because I'm down gearing. So everything is a trade-off. You don't get anything for free. You have to trade either RPS for torque or torque for RPS, and this is the general configuration. Arrows towards an engine for propellers of all sorts. So helicopter propellers, airplane propellers. If you're going to be doing wheels, tank tracks, anything that's touching the ground that has a lot of friction, right? Friction is work, right? You can, and you can do a little test here. Don't do the test, but you can do a test here. Take your hand, fill up the bathtub, push it through water. You'll feel resistance, right? That resistance is robbing your power, right? That's the work you have to do, but you can slip through the water. Now take the same hand and try to push it through the asphalt. All right, you're going to skin all the skin off your hands because it has more friction. And because it has more friction, you need to down gear. You need to point the arrows away. All right, so I hope this was helpful. It's a complex topic, and I understand that a lot of people, a lot of people are young and have never driven a vehicle, and probably most people, have never driven a manual vehicle, and probably definitely most people have never driven a non-synchronous transmission or a big truck. And so I hope this was insightful and interesting. Please ask some questions if you have them. I would do better with some pointed questions. People will say, oh, people have asked me to do a gearing tutorial. And literally, I could talk for 8 hours on this to get every bit of minutia in there. And a lot of it's trial and error and testing. So if you like the video, leave a like. If you haven't subscribed and you like my content, please consider giving a subscription. And please ask some questions if you have any questions about gearing. All right, see you in the next one.